June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers crashed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion force ever assembled. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in 11 days. German panzer divisions were the most feared military force on earth, their tactics perfected through 2 years of unbroken victory. German tank commanders rolled east with supreme confidence, expecting another swift triumph. Then they met the T-34, and everything changed. The first encounter happened near the Lithuanian border on June 23rd, just 1 day into the invasion. A German panzer column spearheaded by Panzer IIIs and IVs was advancing rapidly when Soviet tanks appeared on the ridge ahead. German tank commanders identified them through their optics, unfamiliar silhouettes, low and sleek, moving at surprising speed. The Germans opened fire at standard combat range, roughly 800 meters. Their armor-piercing shells struck the Soviet tanks and bounced off, leaving nothing but scratches on the sloped armor. The Soviet tanks kept coming. At 600 meters, the Germans fired again. Again, their shells ricocheted harmlessly. The range closed to 400 meters, then 200. German tank crews, veterans of campaigns across Europe, felt something they hadn't experienced since the war began: fear. Then the Soviet tanks opened fire. The German Panzer IIIs, with their 50mm of frontal armor, were penetrated easily. Crews died instantly as Soviet shells tore through steel that had seemed adequate against French and British tanks. The survivors radioed back reports that their commanders initially dismissed as panic or exaggeration. Soviet tanks that couldn't be penetrated at combat range? Impossible. But the reports kept coming from every section of the front, all describing the same nightmare. The T-34 wasn't supposed to exist. German intelligence had thoroughly analyzed Soviet military capabilities before Barbarossa. They knew the Soviets had large numbers of tanks, but their assessment was that these were obsolete designs, poorly built and operated by inadequately trained crews. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. In June 1941, the Red Army fielded thousands of light tanks like the T-26 and BT-7, designs from the 1930s that German guns could destroy easily. But German intelligence had missed something crucial. They'd missed the revolution that Soviet tank designers had achieved, and they'd catastrophically underestimated what the Red Army was capable of producing. The story of the T-34 begins not with Stalin's demands or Soviet bureaucracy, but with one brilliant engineer named Mikhail Koshkin. Born into a peasant family in 1898, Koshkin had fought in the Russian Civil War, then worked his way through technical education during the 1920s. By the mid-1930s, he was working at the Kharkov locomotive factory, which had been converted to tank production. The Soviet Union was desperately trying to modernize its military, and tank design was receiving enormous resources and attention. Koshkin studied everything available about tank design: American, British, German, and Soviet developments. He understood that tank design involved brutal compromises. You could have armor, speed, or firepower, but maximizing one meant sacrificing the others. Heavy armor meant slow speed. High speed required lightweight and thus thin armor. Big guns were heavy and took up space. Every design choice created limitations elsewhere. Koshkin's genius was recognizing that these compromises weren't inevitable. They were the result of conventional thinking. If you questioned every assumption, if you were willing to innovate at every level, you could potentially have all three. The key insight concerned armor slope. Traditional tank design used vertical armor plate because it was simpler to manufacture and install, but vertical armor presented its full thickness to incoming shells. Koshkin realized that if you sloped the armor dramatically, 60 degrees or more from vertical, the effective thickness against incoming fire increased enormously without adding weight. A 45mm armor plate at 60 degrees was as effective against penetration as 90mm of vertical armor. You got double the protection for the same weight. This decision drove everything else about the T-34's design. Sloped armor meant a different hull shape, lower, wider, harder to see and hit. It meant rethinking crew positions, internal layouts, everything. Koshkin embraced these challenges. He designed a tank that was radically different from anything that had come before. The hull sloped aggressively from all angles. The turret was rounded. No flat surfaces for shells to strike squarely. The whole design was optimized to deflect rather than absorb hits. For armament, Koshkin chose a 76.2mm gun, larger than anything mounted on medium tanks by other nations at the time. This gun could fire a 6.5-kilogram, armor-piercing shell with enough velocity to penetrate any tank Germany fielded in 1941. It could also fire high explosive shells effective against infantry and fortifications. The gun was powerful enough that the T-34 could engage enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. For mobility, Koshkin selected the V2 diesel engine, a new Soviet design that produced 500 horsepower. Diesel engines were unusual in tanks. Most nations used gasoline engines because they were lighter and more powerful for their weight. But diesel had crucial advantages. It was less flammable than gasoline, improving crew survivability. It was more fuel efficient, extending operational range, and the Soviet Union had vast oil resources more suited to diesel production than high-octane gasoline. The V2 was an aluminum block engine, relatively light for its power output, and it proved remarkably reliable, despite being manufactured under primitive conditions. The combination of powerful engine, wide tracks and reasonable weight, 26 tons for early models, gave the T-34 exceptional mobility. It could reach 53 kilometers per hour on roads, fast for a tank of that era. More importantly, its wide tracks and good ground clearance gave it excellent cross-country performance. The T-34 could traverse mud, snow, and rough terrain that bogged down German panzers with their narrower tracks and less powerful engines. Koshkin pushed his design through Soviet bureaucracy and skeptical military officials who wanted incremental improvements to existing designs, not radical innovations. He arranged a dramatic demonstration in March 1940, personally leading a small convoy of prototype T-34s on a 2,000-kilometer winter journey from Kharkov to Moscow and back, demonstrating the design's reliability and performance. The journey nearly killed him. He developed pneumonia from exposure during the trip and never fully recovered. But he'd proven his tank worked. Stalin personally approved production, and Koshkin died in September 1940, just 42 years old, knowing his design would be built. Production began in 1940 at multiple factories. The Soviets were racing against time, aware that war with Germany was likely. But production was slow initially. The T-34 was complex to manufacture, requiring precision machining and welding techniques that pushed Soviet industrial capabilities. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, only about 200 T-34s had been produced, scattered across dozens of units mixed with thousands of older tanks. This small number, and the chaos of the initial German assault, meant the T-34's impact in the first weeks of Barbarossa was limited. German forces advancing at breakneck speed overran Soviet positions before defenders could organize effective resistance. Soviet logistics collapsed under the German onslaught. Many T-34s were abandoned due to fuel shortages or mechanical breakdowns before they ever engaged the enemy. Crews were often inadequately trained. The Red Army was in the middle of massive expansion, with millions of new recruits and not enough time to train them properly. But when T-34s did engage German forces, the results were shocking. German after-action reports from those first weeks describe encounters that bordered on disbelief. Panzer crews reported firing entire magazines of ammunition at T-34s without effect. They described Soviet tanks shrugging off hits that should have been fatal, continuing to advance while German shells ricocheted into the sky. They described the terror of being engaged by 76mm guns at ranges where German weapons were useless. General Heinz Guderian, perhaps the most respected panzer commander in the Wehrmacht, personally encountered T-34s in late June near Minsk. His forces destroyed several through tactical superiority and numerical advantage, but Guderian was shaken. He later wrote that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world at that time, superior to anything Germany possessed. He immediately sent reports to Berlin demanding accelerated development of German tanks, capable of matching Soviet capabilities. His recommendations were largely ignored. German leadership was convinced the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks, making long-term responses unnecessary. That confidence seemed justified through the summer of 1941. German forces continued their advance, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. By September, German units were approaching Moscow. The Red Army seemed on the verge of total collapse, but the T-34 kept appearing in growing numbers, and German tank crews began to dread encounters with it. They developed tactics to compensate for their technical inferiority, attacking from the sides and rear where T-34 armor was thinner, using superior German optics and radios to coordinate attacks, relying on better crew training to outmaneuver Soviet tanks. But these were adaptations born of desperation, not solutions. German tanks remained vulnerable, while T-34s remained difficult to destroy. The true impact of the T-34 emerged during the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42. German forces, exhausted from 6 months of continuous combat and inadequately prepared for Russian winter conditions, launched their final assault on the Soviet capital in November. Soviet forces, reinforced with fresh troops from Siberia and new equipment including hundreds of T-34s, counterattacked in December. The T-34s proved devastating in winter conditions. Their wide tracks distributed weight effectively, allowing them to traverse snow and frozen ground that immobilized German vehicles. Their diesel engines, while difficult to start in extreme cold, ran reliably once started, while German gasoline engines froze solid. German tanks stuck in snowdrifts or paralyzed by cold were methodically destroyed by T-34s that maneuvered freely across the battlefield. The German retreat from Moscow was a catastrophe, the first major German defeat of the war. The T-34 hadn't single-handedly caused this defeat. Soviet infantry, artillery, weather, logistics, and German overextension all played crucial roles. But the T-34 had demonstrated something terrifying to German planners. The Soviet Union could produce in quantity weapons superior to Germany's best. The Red Army, given time to recover from the initial disasters of 1941, would be a far more formidable opponent than German planning had assumed. German tank development responded to the T-34 threat with increasing urgency. The Panzer IV, Germany's primary medium tank, received upgrades: longer guns, thicker armor. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, incorporated design elements directly copied from the T-34, including sloped armor. The Tiger tank, with its 80mm gun and massive armor, was rushed into production specifically to counter the T-34. These were excellent vehicles, technologically sophisticated and deadly in combat, but they came too late and in insufficient numbers. The T-34's greatest advantage wasn't just its battlefield performance, it was manufacturability. Soviet designers had created a tank that could be mass-produced by a semi-industrialized economy under wartime conditions. The T-34's design prioritized ease of manufacture. Components were designed to be produced with relatively simple machinery. Tolerances were loose compared to German standards. Parts didn't fit together with precision engineering perfection, but they fit well enough to work. Welding was crude but effective. Surface finishes were rough. None of this mattered on the battlefield. Soviet factories produced T-34s at rates that seemed impossible to German analysts. Factory 183, evacuated from Kharkov to the Urals in late 1941, was producing tanks within weeks of reassembly. Workers labored in unheated buildings through Siberian winters. Production lines ran 24 hours a day. Every possible shortcut was taken. Early T-34s left the factory without paint, just bare metal with oil coating to prevent rust. Interior equipment was minimalist. Crew comfort was non-existent, but the tanks worked, and they appeared on the front lines in ever-increasing numbers. By 1942, Soviet factories were producing thousands of T-34s monthly. Production peaked in 1944 with over 14,000 units built that year alone. Total T-34 production during the war exceeded 57,000 vehicles, more than any other tank in history. Germany, despite having the most advanced industrial economy in Europe, produced approximately 9,000 Panthers and 2,300 Tigers. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. For every German heavy tank, the Soviets fielded dozens of T-34s. This numerical superiority compensated for many of the T-34's shortcomings, and it had significant shortcomings. The early T-34 was, despite its revolutionary design, a difficult tank to fight in. The two-man turret, with commander and gunner sharing a cramped space, meant the commander couldn't effectively command the tank while engaging targets. Soviet tankers lacked the sophisticated radios German crews used for coordination. Many T-34s had receivers only, no transmitters, forcing commanders to communicate through hand signals or by physically moving their tanks together. Crew training remained inadequate throughout much of the war. with tankers receiving minimal instruction before being sent to the front. The T-34's optics were inferior to German equivalents. Soviet tankers had trouble identifying and engaging targets at long range, where German crews with their superior sights could see clearly. The transmission was bulky and difficult to shift. Drivers often used hammers to force gears into position. The tank was loud, uncomfortable, and exhausting to operate. Visibility from inside was poor, with limited viewing devices forcing commanders to expose themselves through open hatches to see effectively. Soviet tank crews suffered enormous casualties throughout the war, losses that would have been unbearable for nations with smaller populations. But the T-34 kept improving. In 1943, the T-34-85 variant entered production, mounting an 85mm gun capable of engaging German heavy tanks at reasonable ranges. The turret was enlarged to accommodate a 3-man crew, improving combat effectiveness. Production techniques advanced as workers gained experience and machinery improved. Later T-34s were better finished, more reliable, easier to maintain. Soviet crews gained experience and developed tactics suited to their equipment. Guards tank units, elite formations with better training and equipment, achieved combat effectiveness comparable to German panzer divisions. The impact on German forces was cumulative and devastating. Every battle meant facing more T-34s. German kill ratios remained favorable. Experienced German crews in superior tanks could often destroy multiple T-34s before being knocked out themselves. But favorable ratios didn't matter when you were outnumbered 10-1. German units reported destroying dozens of Soviet tanks in single engagements, only to face more the next day and the next. The Red Army could replace losses. Germany couldn't. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every experienced crew killed was a loss that couldn't be made good. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. The early war years had given German troops confidence that their equipment was superior, their training better, their tactics more advanced. The T-34 shattered these illusions. German infantrymen learned to fear the sound of approaching T-34s, that distinctive engine note, the squeal of tracks on frozen ground. German anti-tank crews found their weapons inadequate. The standard 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns couldn't reliably penetrate T-34 armor at combat ranges. The 88mm flak gun, pressed into service as an anti-tank weapon, was effective but heavy, difficult to move, and vulnerable to return fire. German soldiers developed a grim respect for the T-34 and its crews. They recognized that Soviet tankers, despite inferior training and equipment disadvantages, fought with desperate courage and determination. T-34s attacked regardless of odds, charging German positions in ways that seemed suicidal, but sometimes succeeded through sheer audacity. German accounts describe Soviet tanks continuing to fight after being hit multiple times, burning hulks with surviving crew members still operating the gun, firing until ammunition exploded or the crew was killed. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the peak of German armored capability on the Eastern Front, and the moment when that capability was definitively broken. Germany assembled nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns for Operation Citadel, including hundreds of new Panthers and Tigers. The Soviet forces arrayed against them included over 5,000 tanks, predominantly T-34s of various models. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history. German forces penetrated Soviet defenses in multiple locations, destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks in the opening days. But the losses were replaced immediately. Fresh Soviet tank formations appeared constantly, feeding into the battle as fast as German forces could destroy them. The famous engagement at Prokhorovka on July 12 saw hundreds of tanks engaged in close-range combat across open terrain. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with tanks firing at point-blank range, ramming each other. Individual acts of courage and desperation repeated hundreds of times across the battlefield. German forces inflicted heavier losses on the Soviets at Kursk. Final counts suggest the Red Army lost 3 or 4 tanks for every German vehicle destroyed. But Germany lost the battle because they couldn't sustain their losses while the Soviets could. When Kursk ended, Soviet forces retained offensive capability. German armored forces never fully recovered. From Kursk onward, the Red Army maintained continuous offensive operations, driving steadily west toward Germany. T-34s spearheaded every major Soviet offensive from 1943 through 1945. They broke through German defensive lines at Leningrad, ending the 900-day siege. They led the drives through Ukraine, recapturing vast territories. They crossed the Dnieper River despite desperate German resistance. They liberated Belarusia in Operation Bagration, destroying an entire German army group. They drove through Poland and into Germany itself, terror weapons that German forces could slow but never stop. The final assaults on Berlin in April 1945 saw thousands of T-34s smashing through the final German defenses. German soldiers, many of them teenage conscripts with minimal training and inadequate weapons, faced Soviet tank columns with nothing but handheld anti-tank weapons and futile courage. The streets of Berlin became graveyards for both T-34s and their German opponents. Soviet tankers suffered horrific casualties in urban combat, where their advantages in mobility and numbers were negated, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Red Army had too many tanks, too much artillery, too many soldiers. Germany had nothing left but pride and desperation. When the war ended in May 1945, T-34s were present at every major victory celebration. They rolled through conquered Berlin, their crews exhausted survivors of 4 years of the most brutal combat in human history. They'd fought from Moscow to the German capital, a distance of over 2,600 kilometers, every meter contested. The crews who survived and many didn't. Soviet tank casualties were staggering, had proven themselves in the hardest school imaginable. The T-34's story didn't end with World War II. The design proved so successful that production continued for decades. The Soviet Union supplied T-34s to Allied nations and communist movements worldwide. They saw combat in the Korean War, where American M-26 Pershing tanks found them formidable opponents. They fought in the Middle East in numerous Arab-Israeli conflicts. They appeared in African wars of independence, in Asian conflicts, in revolutions and civil wars across the globe. Some estimates suggest T-34s saw combat in over 40 different conflicts, more than any other tank in history. The design influenced tank development worldwide. The sloped armor concept became universal. Every modern tank uses similar principles. The emphasis on balance between firepower, armor, and mobility shaped post-war tank philosophy. The idea that a good tank should be easily manufactured and maintained became central to military procurement decisions. Western tank designers studied captured T-34s exhaustively, incorporating lessons learned into their own designs. Soviet tankers who survived the war carried memories of the T-34 throughout their lives. Veterans spoke of it with affection mixed with horror. Affection for a machine that had kept them alive, horror at memories of friends burned alive in knocked-out tanks, of desperate battles against impossible odds, of the grinding exhaustion of months and years in combat. They remembered the T-34's engine note, its distinctive silhouette, the cramped interior where they'd spent so much of the war. They remembered specific tanks they'd fought in, gave them names and personalities, mourned them when they were destroyed. German veterans had different memories but equally powerful. They remembered the shock of first encountering T-34s and realizing their equipment was inferior. They remembered the gut-wrenching fear of seeing Soviet tanks advancing across open ground, knowing their own weapons might not stop them. They remembered the growing desperation as the war turned against Germany, as every battle brought more Soviet tanks while German forces grew weaker. Some expressed respect for the T-34's design and for the courage of Soviet crews. Others remained bitter, insisting that German tanks were superior and only numbers had defeated them. Both perspectives held truth. German tanks were often better individually, but the T-34's advantages in production and overall design made it the superior weapon system for the war that was actually fought. Military historians debate the T-34's significance. Some argue it was the single most important weapon of World War II, the tool that broke German military power and enabled Soviet victory. Others contend that while important, the T-34 was just one element in Soviet success. Artillery, air power, infantry, and logistics all played crucial roles. The truth lies somewhere between. The T-34 alone didn't defeat Germany, but Soviet victory would have been impossible, or at least far more costly, without it. What's undeniable is that the T-34 represented a revolution in tank design. It proved that radical innovation could succeed, that questioning every assumption could lead to breakthrough capabilities. It demonstrated that manufacturability was as important as technological sophistication in wartime. It showed that a weapon designed for mass production by a partially industrialized economy could match or exceed weapons produced by the world's most advanced industries. These lessons shaped Cold War military thinking and remain relevant today. The T-34 also represented something less tangible, but equally important: Soviet capability and determination. When Germany invaded in 1941, most observers expected rapid Soviet collapse. The Soviet Union was recovering from Stalin's purges, appeared backward and disorganized, seemed incapable of matching German military prowess. The existence of the T-34 challenged these assumptions. A nation supposedly incapable of technological innovation had produced the world's best tank. A nation supposedly on the verge of collapse had the industrial capacity to build tens of thousands of them. A nation supposedly defeated had the human resources to crew those tanks and the will to fight with them until victory was achieved. Mikhail Koshkin never saw his creations triumph. He died before the German invasion, before the T-34 proved itself in combat, before it became legendary. But his vision, that radical innovation was possible, that superior design could overcome limitations in resources and industrial sophistication, was vindicated completely. The tank he designed became a war winner, a vehicle that changed history. Standing before a preserved T-34 today, knowing its history, is a humbling experience. The machine is smaller than you'd expect, lower and more compact than modern tanks. The armor shows its age, the sloping plates that were so revolutionary now looking almost primitive. But the design's elegance is still visible. You can see why German shells bounced off that glacis plate, why the low profile made it hard to hit, why the wide tracks work so well in mud and snow. You can imagine the crew inside, 3 or 4 men in a space barely large enough to hold them, fighting in heat and cold, fear and exhaustion, for hours or days at a time. You can understand why this machine terrified Germany in 1941, and why that terror only grew as the war progressed. Not because the T-34 was perfect, it wasn't, but because it was good enough, produced in sufficient numbers, operated by crews willing to die in it if necessary. That combination, adequate technology, mass production, and desperate determination, proved unstoppable. The Germans called the T-34 many things during the war. They analyzed it technically, trying to understand how the Soviets had achieved what they had. They respected it professionally, recognizing superior design when they encountered it. They feared it personally, knowing that encountering T-34s likely meant death or injury, but they couldn't stop it. From Moscow to Berlin, the T-34 rolled forward, the iron embodiment of Soviet resistance and eventual victory. That's the T-34's legacy, not just as a machine, but as a symbol of innovation triumphing over convention, of determination overcoming initial disaster, of a nation that was counted out rising to defeat what seemed like inevitable conquest. The tank itself is museum piece now, its combat days long over, but its impact resonates still. A reminder that wars are won not just with superior technology, but with the will to innovate, produce, and fight until victory is achieved, no matter the cost.